So what happens when a new art piece makes a huge breakthrough? Really, the best comparison I can think of is it's kind of like a rogue planet passing through a solar system. All these things that already had courses and orbits are essentially warped. Its gravity pulls and kind of tugs a lot of stuff around it. Not just for future stuff, but for existing things trying just to carry on. A new piece of art bringing a new style further forwards towards the core has a gravity of showing instead what is just possible, what is allowable, both in a financial sense and stylistically. As I mentioned in the first episode, simply trying to categorize this as ripping off, or trying to bunch it all together, is a bit too simplistic, because it infers that the entire idea is merely to ape the specific formula the big thing, in this case Evangelion, did, and to make money off of. So today I'm going to talk about exactly why that isn't really true, and how that very idea breaks down. We are going to look at 3 works who had their gravity warped, who had their tones altered, and how that playing out isn't really as cut and dry as others have said it is. Also, you're going to learn how deconstruction works in under 10 minutes, and how it all ties together, or your money back. Before directing Shingu, Secret of the Stellar Wars, Tatsuo Sato directed another work which is very near and dear to my heart. Martian's successor, Nadesico. Nadesico aired from October of 96 to March of 97. This slotted it in essentially into the same October to March period Evangelion had, but delayed by 1 year. Nadesico is, as a whole, a show I like quite a bit. I watched it in high school during Argenbolt's radical Martian phase, right as I was playing Zone of the Enders for the first time and becoming obsessed with the Red Planet. I especially bonded with the fact that it was right around when I learned to cook, and Akito Tenkawa, the main character of that series, was originally just somebody who wanted to be a chef. So that was kinda neat. It is, all in all, a show directly in the lineage of Gundam, and of course going by the ship's name being the title, also Space Battleship Yamato. But it's a really fun work overall, which is at times an outright parody of the mecha genre. Now this means it is, yes, the often maligned or misinterpreted phrase, a deconstruction. Soredemo. It is not the same deconstruction Evangelion is. Deconstructions are, after all, a messy thing. Even the word, it kind of ends up implying a lot to people that it doesn't always necessarily mean. There's quite a bit of nuance here. Now, boy, if only there was, say, like a really cool freaking chart we could look at. So, you have a genre. The genre created some trends, but now the trends are getting a bit played out. You want to do something with them, something playful. Enter the Argenbolt 2-axis and 4-corner chart on deconstruction. Basically, this helps me, now you, break down stories that are called deconstructions a bit easier. Now, is it a perfect system? Hell no. Does it indulge in a bit of, simplistic TV tropesism? Unfortunately, yes. But it does help me keep this video under 45 minutes, so we're going to use it. Here you see essentially the 2 main ways the stories make us feel, either happy or sad about the genre, and on the other axis, how it breaks down the conventions. Does it reaffirm them as super cool and confident, or does it make them look kind of silly and has some fun making fun of them? Now luckily Mecha has examples of all of these, and these are by no means binaries either. Like a 30 degrees tilted political alignment chart, it is possible to dip all over here in a single work. But you can get works that kind of strongly lean one way or another. Gurren Lagann is a very, very blunt reaffirmation of the myth that robots are really, really cool. Gunsword, on the other hand, very often dips into the outright comedy of how insane the notion of these things being a normal form of combat is. That led where the movie 2 is a outright demythologization that there is anything special about a human-shaped robot. And the very recent Gundam Jikwakusu is essentially a work that is basically incomprehensible if you don't see it through the lens of it being one giant nostalgic fanfiction, more or less. Returning to the main topic of this series, Evangelion here and its deconstruction firmly falls towards the right side. While occasionally fun and occasionally willing to show how cool the robots are in some kind of outright sense, Eva is also very concerned with pulling apart the genre and simultaneously indulging in the nostalgia. Its final thesis in the original show and movie is ultimately one built around accepting oneself in order to feel worthy of happiness. But boy, howdy, the road to get there is by no means fun or bloodless. It's nostalgic in how many references it pulls from, but it's also very deconstructive in how it critically applies psychology to the anime bullshit tropes of its characters. It grounds and thus de-fantasticalizes everything from the trauma of being in giant robot battles to how these character types struggle with internal issues, to how logistically supplying and moving huge Ultraman robots would work. And as I've mentioned before, it wasn't the first to do all of these, but this is more or less the main combination. Now, Nadesico, in comparison, is useful as a kind of alternative mirror. It's a far more fun show in its deconstruction. Going into some spoilers for those who haven't seen it, most of the enemies are unmanned robots, and the direct power behind them is one obsessed with a giant robot show from the 1970s. There are quite a few comedy beats, and Akito is just a happier guy all around, whose coming of age is tied into much less traumatic and more pleasant romantic developments. It's not really a giveaway to say that the whole show is essentially one long love story. What this means is that Nadesico sits firmly towards the reaffirmation of the myth, as in big robots are cool and fun, and a bordering on outright burlesque satire at times. It's a show which feels generally fun and happy to watch. Now, why did I just explain all this? Well, mainly because, yes, now that you understand roughly how deconstruction works, the gravitational warping I began with can come into play here. Nadesico's movie, Prince of Darkness. Yeah, the name gives it away. It was a pretty big victim of this, I feel. Eva's even darker film and the end of Eva in general premiering in July 1997 had a similar Nadesico film that would premiere a year later in the summer of 98. It was a kind of pattern of wrap up your popular anime series with some kind of tie-in. Now here Nadesico's show had a lot of lingering plot elements. There were cursory, bits that never got wrapped up, and even a little bit of investigation into its background suggests that Noboru Kaikawa, the story editor, may have written like a 50-episode plot, but ended up with a 26-episode show. So we'd think, hey, that's it. We use the 90-minute movie to tie it all together, right? Wrap up all those loose plot threads and just do a general victory lap showing off our established characters. Well, no. The Prince of Darkness shifts the entire focal characters away from Akito. Akito is now mostly a stoic badass deuteragonist, maybe just general anti-hero who's doing things in the background but isn't the focus. While the animation is super cool, the general tone of the plot is now notably darker and serious. Now, I do not have a smoking gun. I do not have a memo saying, make Nadesico movie into Eva. No. I tried contacting the director on the current shit heap state of Twitter, but I got no dice. So the end result is a pretty unstable and not altogether satisfying product. It's neither confidently pushing the story forward nor satisfyingly tying up the show's loose ends. What I think happened here was what I kind of mentioned in the video's start. Eva's passage and success likely warping Nadesico's film production. But as I mentioned already, I don't think this was as simple as a copycat kind of deal either. Nadesico was, in its own way, already also a deconstruction of mecha as Eva was. It just wasn't doing the same deconstruction style Eva was doing, really. The show already had a few more serious moments and plot points, so what we have here is then less outright copying and more a kind of strange repolarization of, just how to best deconstruct or make a new mecha thing, and how that should take place. Now, if this was it, I would consider it perhaps a one-off fluke. However, there are some more. Overlapping with Evangelion's broadcast was another series near and dear to my heart, like really near and dear. Argon Bolt's technical first ever mecha show from Japan, The Vision of Escaflowne, airing from April to September of 1996. This one is far less deconstructive. I think I would go as far as saying it's not deconstructive at all. Escaflowne is really an entry into the tradition of Tomino's Dunbine, or the later and very popular Rayearth. It's an isekai used as an excuse to bring a protagonist to a medieval world where mechs work more like giant knights than as tanks or jet fighters. Based roughly on a manga run originally penned by Macross's Shoji Kawamori. Yes, that is right. Armored Core 6 has Walter's HAL AC parts, also designed by Kawamori, with this very interesting chest thing here. And For Answer had Kawamori's white glint, both as direct descendants, really, of Escaflowne. The mech, not the show. Overall, having rewatched it recently, it is kind of pretty fun still. The plot or themes or character arcs are never, crazy. They never do something insane. But it does feel like a confident, whole anime based on a kind of very 90s Japanese RPG idea of a setting. It's generally pretty cool. There's a lot of good animation in the fights, and if you're a fan of the 90s Bishonen pretty boys with wings, well, I think this one may beat out FF7 and Gundam Wing for that. So that all being said, it is mostly a serious show. Its production staff is populated with a lot of what I like to think of as the Bones generation from Sunrise. Those who would very shortly do Cowboy Bebop, and then fund the, studio of the same name as well. Once again, Yoko Kanno, who I mentioned before in the Brainpowered video, provides another great OST. But while at times, pretty good, it mostly floats around a sword and sorcery action-adventure level of things like violence or seriousness. However, in 2000, the newly created Studio Bones, having just solidified, moved to make a film entry for the show. This would be their inaugural movie project, followed up by the very much better known 2001's Cowboy Bebop, Knocking on Heaven's Door. But like Nadesico, Escaflowne's movie would also shift to a notably darker tone. Whereas the main character Hitomi in the show is a girl, broadly overwhelmed by the romantic tangles of high school, she isn't otherwise that gloomy. Her draw to the fantasy world of Gaia is born more out of an acknowledgement of the cross-up of her romantic feelings and friendship than anything else. The movie Hitomi is more openly depressed and introverted. The violence and scale of action has gone up, literally in how big the actual Escaflowne mechs, just are. Its plot is like a loose retelling at best of the overarching story, and it instead condenses and plays up the bigger beats. And there are some, wipeouts, people getting wiped out in this one. Now here I bring it up for a slightly different reason. Once again, it would be easy to say, so there was a memo. If do movie, do dark, like End of Eva. And that would easily explain all of this. But I don't know and can't find any existence of that. So here I'm going to put forward an alternative. Broadly, one of the big reasons Eva resonated was because of the material conditions of Japan in the 90s. It hit it big with, the economic pains of a generation of kids who felt pretty confidently things were not going good, and whose lives would be a good deal harder than the lives of their parents. It was this kind of introverted batch of depressives that Eva synced with very well. But Eva, it didn't invent that. Isekai as a genre using things like death or depression or suicide to channel a general misery and escapism of, I want to get out of my life, is a much bigger thing also fed by those material conditions. So the Escaflowne film could have shifted as easily as that. Eva showed you can tap into the stuff more head on, so why not let's do that with our already present and done isekai story. But the other reason is I think a little more abstract. That being that as Eva showed tonally what was possible and successful to lean into, Studio Bones itself it's kind of already was there and was ready and waiting to do that. The OG Bones generation were making violent, more mature, more serious OVAs with high production values for Orgus, Macross with Macross Plus, and Gundam with Stardust Memory. Bebop itself is essentially one big masterwork thesis, that I hope to do a long video on at some point, of exactly that. A story mostly about adults grappling with adult issues in a fun anime sci-fi but ultimately grounded world. An extension of Lupin III or City Hunter or so on. So from this view, Eva is less the progenitor and inventor of the make anime plus serious and dark approach, and more a green light on a road the Bones generation was already very happy driving along. In that way, Escaflowne's film is just them bringing Escaflowne up to their level of production and tone they wanted to do more of. And after all, as I mentioned before, Bebop's movie would be a year later, so they would keep up the serious tone with that, and into the early 2000s with Fullmetal Alchemist's initial show, and another work we will get back to later to probably wrap this series up with. For now, though, I want to highlight one last one which shifted, and I think maybe did so the most interestingly and well. Over the 90s, the Brave series, starting with Brave X Kaiser, kind of became a staple of mecha anime. This led then to the very popular and well-known Gabaghoul. So Sunrise had a very different run of shows, which I haven't talked about very much from the usual fare. These were squarely aimed at very young viewers and were there to make some cool friggin' robots that you could then sell, cool friggin' toys off of. The Brave series was just that. Loud, bright, flashy, and with heaps of combining, very autism-satisfying, mechanical interlocking giant robots. Unapologetically toyetic. In many ways, you could not get further away from the introverted depression of Evangelion if you tried. Brave shows are, to me, kind of just a little too simple to talk about in depth. They're very fun, they're very cool, but I don't have much to say. However, I do think they're kind of a good proof of humanity. If you can watch the insane Gatai sequences and, smile even just a little smile at the over-the-top smashing of machines and music as, the characters scream out attacks, I think you still have a little bit of a real human soul in you. But the reason I bring them up is because of the black sheep, the odd one out of the series, Betterman. Betterman is probably my favorite of the group that I watched as an actual adult because it treads such a weird, fine tonal line. After all, if you have a series which is in flat out no way a deconstruction, it is as self-indulgently super robot as you can get, what then happens if, someone says, make it dark? This project was helmed by the just usual Brave staff and Gabaghoul's director, Yoshitomo Yonatani. It wasn't a B team or anything like that. Airing from April to September of 1999, over 26 episodes, Betterman is outright way darker than the previous series by far. The protagonists of Keita and Hinoki are both 17, which is much older than the usual Brave's main characters. The overall lighting and world is just visually dark, with many battles and events happening at night or underground, and in comparison to Gabaghoul and the previous Braves, the main big hero fighting thing isn't a giant robot, really. It's Lamia, a mysterious character in the story who henshins into various kaiju and, attacks and beats the various threats, most of whom are also not mechanical in nature. Now, I don't want to spoil the plot, but it's one that feels directly rooted in the kinds of darker, weirder 70s SF Eva also drew from, rather than the more typical bright Super Robo archetypes. Really, the closest is maybe bits of the Getter Robo manga in terms of who the true antagonists are and what they really represent. But the reason I bring it up is, to me, because it feels like the most confident post-Eva course shift, and the most dramatic from the original trend. When it comes to mecha of this period, the main character is an awkward dork, not a screaming Super Robo pilot or generally happy younger Braves boy main character, but he's definitely more optimistic than Shinji. Now, in the show, events of mass death from weird supernatural threats often do occur, and they echo a lot of the things like the anxieties over the sarin gas attacks that troubled the Japanese people in their media in this period. But it kind of just, it kind of just pulls it all off, because it really is kind of just that sense of telling someone creative, in this case probably Yoshitomo Yonatani, okay, just do something dark like Eva, but everything after that, do whatever you want. And in response, he went and ran in his own weird direction. So much so it doesn't feel like, and doesn't really come off as a ripoff, and it also probably isn't usually brought up in that way to be like Evangelion, a popular work. So, in that sense, a darker tone or darker ideas, the things I started with, in this case, it really was just kind of a general guidepost and not some exact formula. And I think it also kind of shows what I began with, that that's all there is to it sometimes. A big work just has to open the door on a way that the trend can kind of grow and redevelop after getting a bit stale. And there are plenty of folks with ideas then ready to give it a go. But you can't really boil it down or simplify it to just ripping off. As much as you can get an Inception after The Matrix, or a Game of Thrones after The Lord of the Rings, or a Sopranos after The Goodfellas, or Sinners after a Get Out. So, Nadesico show, very good. Highly recommend. Fun, Gekiganger 3. Movie, cool action scenes, I guess. Escaflowne show, cool. Night Mecha, do you like RPG stuff? Escaflowne movie, cool action scenes, I guess. And Betterman, pretty good actually, I think kind of slept on. Now, we've been through a bunch of examples that trend from the more traditional super robot kind of background. But what about the military realism that Gundam and Dougram kind of cemented? I mean, it's not like those shows stopped existing, right? Ava's effects didn't just affect the things that were like Ava, and its supposed ripping off was present there as well. So next time, we will be looking at 2 examples of just that, and what it even meant in Blue Gender and Gasaraki.